Alexander Kane stood frozen in the doorway of his master bedroom, his steel-gray eyes fixed on something that shouldn't exist in his meticulously ordered world. There, nestled against the white marble fireplace, sat a pair of tiny pink baby shoes, no bigger than his thumb. The soft cotton fabric was worn but clean, with delicate white laces that had been tied with the careful precision of someone who truly cared. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His jaw tightened as he stepped closer, expensive Italian, leather shoes clicking against the polished hardwood floor. The mansion's silence seemed to amplify every sound, every breath. Alexander Kane didn't do children. He didn't do families. He especially didn't do mysterious baby shoes appearing in his private sanctuary like some kind of cosmic joke. The shoes couldn't have belonged to any of his staff. He knew the employment history of every person who worked in the Kane estate, and none of them had children young enough to wear something so impossibly small. His housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, was in her 60s with grown children living across the country. The gardening crew consisted of middle-aged men who barely spoke English, let alone brought their families to work. His security team was comprised of former military personnel who treated his property like a fortress. Alexander crouched down, his 6'3" frame folding as he examined the shoes without touching them. They were hand-knitted, he realized, with tiny pearl buttons sewn along the sides. Someone had spent hours creating these miniature masterpieces, stitching love into every fiber. The thought made his chest tighten in a way he didn't recognize. He pulled out his phone and dialed his head of security. "Marcus, I need you in my bedroom, now." 3 minutes later, Marcus Thompson appeared, his former Navy SEAL training evident in his swift, silent approach. The man's dark eyes immediately spotted the anomaly. "Sir, I can confirm those weren't here during my security sweep this morning. Then how did they get here?" Alexander's voice carried the same edge that had built his technology empire from nothing, the tone that made board members shift uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus circled the fireplace, his trained gaze scanning for any signs of intrusion. No broken windows, no disturbed locks, no footprints on the grounds. Whoever left these had legitimate access to the house. The implications hit Alexander like a physical blow. Someone on his staff, someone he trusted with his privacy, his safety, his secrets, had violated that trust. But why leave baby shoes? Was it a threat? A message? Some elaborate scheme to extort money from Seattle's most ruthless CEO? Alexander Kane had built his empire on the foundation of absolute control. At 34, he commanded a technology corporation worth billions, employed thousands of people across 6 continents, and owned properties that most people could only dream of visiting. His penthouse mansion overlooking Elliott Bay represented the pinnacle of success, a glass and steel monument to what happened when ambition met ruthless intelligence. Yet as he stared at those tiny pink shoes, Alexander felt something crack in the armor he'd spent decades constructing. The sensation was foreign, uncomfortable, like a splinter working its way under his skin. He'd built his life to be predictable, efficient, and most importantly, solitary. Relationships were liabilities. Emotions were weaknesses. Children were complications he'd never wanted to understand. The irony wasn't lost on him that a man who'd revolutionized communication technology could barely communicate with another human being on a personal level. His dating life consisted of carefully orchestrated encounters with women who understood the rules, expensive dinners, brief companionship, and no expectations beyond the present moment. He'd made his position clear from the beginning of every relationship. He wasn't looking for love, marriage, or family. He was looking for convenience. His childhood had taught him that lesson with brutal efficiency. Growing up in a trailer park in Spokane, Alexander had watched his mother cycle through a series of men who promised stability but delivered chaos. Each new relationship brought hope that this time would be different, that they'd finally have the family his mother desperately craved. Instead, they'd had broken promises, midnight departures, and the kind of poverty that made a boy swear he'd never be vulnerable again. By the time he was 16, Alexander had already started his first tech company from his bedroom, using stolen Wi-Fi from the local library and a laptop he'd assembled from discarded parts. While other teenagers were worried about prom dates and college applications, he was coding 18-hour days and dreaming of escape. Money wasn't just about comfort for Alexander Kane. It was about never having to depend on anyone else for survival. He'd succeeded beyond his wildest teenage fantasies. The scared, angry boy from Spokane had transformed himself into one of the most powerful men in America. But success had come at a price that he was only beginning to understand. His mother had died 3 years earlier, alone in a nursing home that he'd paid for but rarely visited. Her funeral had been attended by more of his employees than his actual family, because he didn't have a family. He had a corporation, an empire, and an empty mansion filled with expensive things that impressed no one. Now staring at those baby shoes, Alexander felt the weight of all his choices pressing down on him like the Seattle rain that seemed to fall endlessly outside his windows. "Sir?" Marcus's voice broke through his thoughts. "Should I review the security footage?" Alexander nodded, grateful for something concrete to focus on. "Pull everything from the last 48 hours. I want to know who had access to this room and when." As Marcus left to begin his investigation, Alexander found himself alone with the shoes again. He walked to his floor-to-ceiling windows and stared out at the city sprawling below him. Somewhere in those streets lived the person who'd created these tiny masterpieces. Someone who understood love in a way that he'd spent his entire adult life avoiding. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant reminding him about the board meeting scheduled for that afternoon. Kane Technologies was in the middle of acquiring a smaller company, a deal that would add another $50 million to their quarterly profits. Under normal circumstances, Alexander would already be in his office, reviewing projections and preparing for the inevitable resistance from shareholders who thought they understood business better than he did. Instead, he found himself canceling the meeting. The decision shocked him almost as much as finding the shoes. Alexander Kane didn't cancel meetings. He didn't rearrange his schedule for mysteries or emotions or tiny pink baby shoes that had no business existing in his world. Yet here he was, calling his assistant and listening to her barely concealed surprise as he instructed her to reschedule everything until further notice. "Is everything all right, Mr. Kane?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Rebecca asked, her professional concern evident even through the phone. "Everything's fine," he lied smoothly. "I just need to handle a personal matter." Personal matters were another thing Alexander Kane didn't have. His life was compartmentalized into work, more work, and brief intervals of sleep. He didn't have hobbies, close friends, or family obligations that required his attention. His personal life consisted of a gym membership he rarely used and a wine collection that impressed visitors but gathered dust between dinner parties he hosted for business purposes. After hanging up with Rebecca, Alexander walked through his mansion with new eyes. The space that had once felt like a showcase of his success now seemed hollow, like a museum exhibit titled "How the Rich Live" rather than an actual home. Artwork on his walls had been selected by an interior designer based on investment potential rather than emotional connection. The furniture was beautiful but uncomfortable, chosen for aesthetic appeal rather than the possibility that someone might actually want to relax on it. In his kitchen, which featured restaurant-quality appliances that he'd never learned to use properly, Alexander opened the refrigerator and found the usual collection of takeout containers and energy drinks. The only thing he'd ever cooked in this kitchen was coffee, and even that came from an automated machine that probably cost more than most people's cars. The baby shoes were still waiting for him when he returned to his bedroom, as if they had somehow anchored themselves to his consciousness. Alexander realized he'd been hoping they might disappear, that he'd imagined the entire incident in some kind of stress-induced hallucination. No such luck. He decided to examine them more closely, pulling on a pair of leather gloves before carefully lifting one of the shoes. It weighed almost nothing, but somehow felt heavier than any contract he'd ever signed. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, every stitch perfectly placed, every detail considered with the kind of attention that suggested the creator had poured their heart into the work. Inside the shoe, his fingers found something unexpected, a tiny piece of paper, folded so small it was almost invisible. Alexander's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded it, revealing a message written in delicate handwriting for Emma's little one. May she always know she is loved. Oh, Emma. The name hit him like a physical force, dragging memories from the carefully locked corners of his mind. There had been an Emma in his life once, though that felt like a lifetime ago. Emma Rodriguez had worked as a night custodian in the Kane Technologies building, one of the invisible army of people who kept his empire running while he slept in his expensive bed. But that Emma had been fired 6 months ago for theft. Security cameras had caught her taking food from the employee cafeteria after hours, and Alexander had personally signed the termination papers without a second thought. Corporate policy was corporate policy, and he didn't make exceptions, regardless of circumstances. Could this be the same Emma? Had she somehow gained access to his home to leave these shoes as some kind of message? The thought that she might be seeking revenge made his blood run cold, but something about the gentle message didn't fit the profile of someone planning harm. Alexander walked to his home office and pulled up the employment records on his private server. Emma Rodriguez, 26 years old, hired as part of the night custodial staff 18 months ago. Clean background check, perfect attendance record until the last few weeks of her employment, when she'd started calling in sick frequently. The theft had been discovered during a routine security review, and she'd been terminated immediately. He stared at her employment photo, a young woman with warm brown eyes and a hesitant smile, the kind of person who probably apologized for taking up space in elevators. She didn't look like someone capable of elaborate revenge schemes or breaking into billionaires' mansions. She looked tired, worried, and heartbreakingly young. The theft report provided more details. Emma had been caught on camera taking sandwiches, fruit, and baby formula from the employee cafeteria. Baby formula. Alexander felt something twist in his chest as he read the security guard's notes. She hadn't been stealing random items or expensive equipment. She'd been taking food, specifically items that suggested she was feeding someone very young. For the first time since firing her, Alexander wondered about the circumstances that had led to her desperation. He'd never asked why she'd stolen food instead of money, why she'd risked a steady job for sandwiches and baby formula. In his world, theft was theft, and consequences were absolute. But now, holding tiny baby shoes that someone had crafted with obvious love, Alexander began to question his own certainty. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Marcus appeared on the screen, his expression grim. "Sir, I've reviewed the security footage. You're going to want to see this." 20 minutes later, Alexander sat in his private security office, watching grainy black and white footage on multiple monitors. Marcus fast-forwarded through hours of empty hallways and quiet rooms until he reached the timestamp that mattered. "There," Marcus said, pointing to one of the screens. 3:15 this morning. Alexander leaned forward, watching a slight figure move through his kitchen with the confidence of someone who knew the layout intimately. The person was wearing dark clothing and moving carefully, but not furtively, more like someone trying not to wake sleeping family members than a burglar attempting to avoid detection. "Can you enhance the image?" Marcus worked at the keyboard, zooming in and adjusting the contrast. Slowly, the figure's features became clearer. Alexander's breath caught in his throat. It was Emma Rodriguez. But this wasn't the Emma from her employment photo. This woman looked exhausted, haunted, like someone who'd been pushed far beyond her limits. Her clothes hung loose on her frame, suggesting recent weight loss, and she moved with the careful precision of someone conserving energy. How did she get in? Alexander asked, though part of him was more interested in why she'd come. That's the interesting part, Marcus replied, switching to a different camera angle. She used a service entrance that's normally locked, but someone had left it propped open from the inside. I'm still investigating, but it looks like she might have had help. They watched as Emma made her way through the mansion's lower level, avoiding the main corridors where motion sensors would have triggered alarms. She moved like someone familiar with the building's security systems, taking a route that kept her in the blind spots between cameras. She's been here before, Alexander realized. She knows this place, Marcus nodded grimly. The question is how. Her employment records show she only worked in the downtown office building, never at your residence. Alexander studied the footage as Emma reached his bedroom. She moved carefully around his sleeping form, placing something small near the fireplace before retreating just as quietly as she'd arrived. The entire visit had taken less than 10 minutes, but she'd managed to penetrate security that was supposed to be impenetrable. Sir, there's something else, Marcus said, his voice unusually hesitant. I ran background checks on all current staff members, cross-referencing with anyone who might have known Mays. Rodriguez, one name came up. Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. Who? Maria Santos, your current housekeeper. She and Emma Rodriguez share the same last known address, a women's shelter downtown. They might be connected. The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. Maria had worked for him for 8 months, since shortly after Mrs. Patterson had retired. She was quiet, efficient, and invisible in the way that domestic staff learned to be around wealthy employers. He'd barely spoken to her beyond basic instructions about his preferences for household management. Bring her to my office, Alexander said quietly. Now, while Marcus went to find Maria, Alexander remained in the security office, replaying the footage of Emma's midnight visit. There was something about her movements, a desperate, careful quality that spoke of someone who'd run out of options. She hadn't taken anything, hadn't damaged anything, hadn't even turned on the lights. She'd simply left a gift, if that's what the baby shoes were, and disappeared back into the night. The door opened behind him, and he heard Marcus's voice. Mr. Kane, this is Maria Santos. Alexander turned to face a middle-aged Latina woman whose dark eyes were wide with fear. She stood in the doorway as if she might bolt at any moment, her hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. Please, sit down, Alexander said, gesturing to a chair. His voice was gentler than usual, though he wasn't sure why. Maria perched on the edge of the chair, her entire body radiating tension. Did I do something wrong, Mr. Kane? I need to ask you about Emma Rodriguez, Alexander said, watching her reaction carefully. The name hit Maria like a physical blow. Her face went pale, and her hands began to shake. I don't know anyone by that name, she said quickly, but her eyes told a different story. Alexander pulled up Emma's employment photo on his computer screen and turned it toward Maria. Are you sure? Maria's composure cracked like glass. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she stared at the screen, and her shoulders began to shake. With suppressed sobs, "Please," she whispered, "don't fire me. I need this job. My children need me to keep this job." I'm not going to fire you, Alexander said, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. But I need to know the truth. Emma was in my house last night. She left something in my bedroom. I need to understand why. Maria wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, leaving streaks on her brown skin. Emma is my daughter, she said finally. My youngest daughter. The words hung in the air between them like a confession. Alexander felt his understanding of the situation shift and realign. Emma hadn't been a vengeful ex-employee seeking revenge. She'd been a desperate daughter asking her mother for help. "Why didn't you tell me when I hired you that your daughter used to work for my company?" "Because you fired her," Maria said simply. "And because I needed the job to help her." Alexander studied Maria's face, seeing the resemblance to Emma now that he knew to look for it. The same warm brown eyes, the same hesitant smile, the same quality of apologizing for existing that seemed to run in their family. "Tell me about the baby shoes," he said quietly. Maria's tears started fresh, and for a moment Alexander thought she might not answer. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she began to speak. "Emma had a baby 3 months ago. A little girl named Luna. The father left when he found out Emma was pregnant, and Emma had to work 2 jobs to pay for her prenatal care. She was so tired, Mr. Kane, working here at night and at a diner during the day, but she was trying so hard to do the right thing." Alexander felt something cold and heavy settle in his stomach. "She was pregnant when she worked for me." Maria nodded. "She kept it hidden because she was afraid of losing the job. She needed the health insurance, needed the steady income. But the pregnancy was hard on her. She was sick a lot, especially in the mornings. That's why she started missing work." The pieces of Emma's story were falling into place like evidence in a trial that Alexander was losing. Every detail made his own actions look more callous, more cruel. "The theft," he said. "She was stealing baby formula." "Emma wasn't eating," Maria said, her voice growing stronger as she defended her daughter. "She was giving all her money to the medical bills, and she was so thin. Mr. Kane, the baby wasn't getting enough nutrition. She was desperate. She knew it was wrong, but she didn't know what else to do." Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his ignorance pressing down on him. He'd fired a pregnant woman for trying to feed her unborn child. He'd destroyed someone's life over baby formula and sandwiches worth less than he spent on a single business lunch. "Where is she now?" he asked. "At the shelter with Luna," Maria whispered. "They were staying with me, but my apartment is too small, and the landlord said no babies." Emma tried to find work, but without a reference from her last job. She trailed off, but the implication was clear. Alexander Kane, in his infinite corporate wisdom, had created a situation where a young mother couldn't find work because he'd blacklisted her for trying to survive. "The baby shoes," he said again. "Why did she leave them?" Maria's smile was heartbreaking in its sadness. "Emma knitted those when she was pregnant. She made dozens of pairs, dreaming about dressing Luna in pretty things. But they don't have anywhere safe to live now, nowhere for Luna to wear pretty shoes. I think she wanted someone to know that Luna exists, that she matters. That even if Emma can't give her daughter everything, she still loves her enough to make beautiful things with her own hands." The explanation hit Alexander harder than any business loss, any boardroom betrayal, any corporate setback he'd ever experienced. Emma hadn't left the shoes as a threat or a manipulation. She'd left them as a testament to love so pure it could create beauty even in the midst of desperation. He thought about his own mother, who'd worked multiple jobs to keep them housed and fed, who'd made his clothes by hand because store-bought was too expensive. He thought about the pride in her voice when she'd called to tell people about his first business success, and the hurt in her eyes during their last conversation when he'd been too busy to visit. "Mr. Kane?" Maria's voice broke through his thoughts. "What are you going to do?" Alexander looked at this woman who'd risked her own job to help her daughter, who'd lied to him by omission because love had demanded that sacrifice. He thought about Emma, knitting baby shoes in a shelter while dreaming of a better life for her daughter. He thought about Luna, an innocent child whose entire future might be determined by the choices he made in the next few minutes. For 34 Years, Alexander Kane had made decisions based on logic, profit, and self-protection. He'd built an empire by being smarter, harder, and more ruthless than everyone around him. But as he sat in his security office, surrounded by monitors and alarms and all the technology that was supposed to keep him safe from the world, Alexander realized that he'd been protecting himself from the wrong things. He'd been so afraid of being vulnerable, of being hurt, of being taken advantage of, that he'd forgotten how to be human. "I'm going to fix this," he said finally, though he wasn't entirely sure what that meant. Maria's eyes widened. "Sir?" Alexander stood up, his mind already racing through possibilities. "I need Emma's contact information. The shelter address, a phone number, anything you have." "Mr. Kane, she's not expecting anything from you. She doesn't even know I work here. She needed help, and I couldn't watch my daughter and granddaughter live on the streets." "She won't be living on the streets," Alexander said, his voice carrying the same certainty he brought to million-dollar deals. "Not anymore." As Maria wrote down the information with trembling hands, Alexander found himself thinking about those tiny pink shoes, sitting in his bedroom like an accusation and a promise. Someone had poured love into every stitch, had dreamed of a little girl wearing them while taking her first steps in a world full of possibility. Alexander Kane had spent his entire adult life accumulating power, but he'd never used it for anything that truly mattered. Maybe it was time to change that. Maybe it was time to discover what he could build with love instead of fear. The shelter address Maria handed him was in a part of Seattle that Alexander had never visited, despite living in the city for over a decade. As he looked at the unfamiliar street name, he realized that Emma's world and his had existed in the same city but different universes, separated by more than just money, separated by hope, opportunity, and the kind of safety that came from knowing someone would catch you if you fell. Alexander had never needed anyone to catch him because he'd never allowed himself to fall. But maybe, just maybe, it was time to learn what it felt like to reach out instead of building walls. The baby shoes were still waiting for him when he returned to his bedroom, but now they looked different. Instead of an intrusion, they looked like an invitation to step into a world where love mattered more than profit, where tiny hands and beating hearts were worth more than any balance sheet. Alexander Kane picked up the shoes, cradling them in his large hands like the precious gifts they were. Tomorrow he would find Emma Rodriguez and her daughter Luna. Tomorrow he would try to understand what it meant to use his power for something other than self-protection. Tomorrow he would begin to learn what those tiny pink shoes had been trying to teach him, that the most important things in life were also the most fragile, and they required not just money or success to protect them, they required love. The Compass Point Women's Shelter sat wedged between a pawn shop and a laundromat on a street that Seattle's city planners had clearly forgotten. Alexander Kane's Bentley looked obscenely out of place as he pulled up to the curb, the polished black exterior reflecting the gray morning light like a mirror that had wandered into the wrong universe. He'd never been to this part of the city before, despite living in Seattle for over a decade, and the realization made him uncomfortable in ways he couldn't articulate. He sat in the driver's seat for several minutes, engine off, staring at the shelter's weathered brick facade. The building had probably been beautiful once, maybe a hotel or apartment complex from the 1920s, but decades of budget cuts and deferred maintenance had left it looking tired and worn. A small sign by the entrance read, "Compass Point, Safe Harbor for Women and Children," and below that, in smaller letters, no one turned away. Alexander had arrived without calling ahead, without making an appointment, without any of the careful planning that usually preceded his business meetings. He'd simply gotten in his car and driven, following the address Maria had given him like a man possessed. Now faced with actually walking through those doors, he felt paralyzed by uncertainty. What was he going to say to Emma Rodriguez? How did someone apologize for destroying a pregnant woman's life over baby formula? How did he explain that he'd never bothered to ask why she was stealing food instead of money, never considered that desperation might have its own logic? His phone buzzed with messages from his office. Rebecca was trying to reschedule the meetings he'd canceled. Board members were asking questions about his sudden absence, and investors were growing nervous about his unexplained disappearance. From the corporate world, Alexander Kane had never been unreachable, never been unavailable, never put personal matters ahead of business obligations. He turned off his phone. The shelter's lobby was smaller than his walk-in closet, with fluorescent lighting that made everyone look slightly sick and furniture that had probably been donated from various sources over the years. Nothing matched, but everything was clean and carefully arranged to create the impression of warmth despite the institutional setting. A bulletin board near the entrance was covered with job postings, parenting class schedules, and colorful drawings that had obviously been created by children. At the reception desk, a woman in her 50s with silver-streaked hair and kind eyes looked up from a computer that appeared to be at least a decade old. Her nameplate read, Janet Morrison, Director, and she wore the kind of practical clothing that suggested someone who'd learned to prioritize function over fashion. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice carrying the careful politeness of someone accustomed to dealing with all kinds of visitors, from social workers to police officers to desperate family members. "I'm looking for Emma Rodriguez," Alexander said, then immediately felt foolish. He couldn't just walk into a women's shelter and demand to see someone. I'm her former employer. There's been a misunderstanding, and I need to speak with her." Janet's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, her professional warmth cooling by several degrees. "Mr. Kane, Alexander Kane." The recognition was immediate. Janet's eyebrows rose slightly, and Alexander could practically see her reassessing the situation. Seattle's business community wasn't that large, and his face had been on enough magazine covers to make him recognizable to anyone who paid attention to local news. "Mr. Kane," Janet said carefully, "Emma Rodriguez is a resident here with her infant daughter. Our policy is to protect the privacy and safety of all our residents." I fired her 6 months ago," Alexander interrupted, then immediately regretted the bluntness of his confession. "I made a mistake, a serious mistake. I need to make it right." Janet studied him for a long moment, her experienced eyes taking in his expensive suit, his obvious discomfort, and whatever desperation was showing on his face. "What kind of mistake?" Alexander found himself explaining the situation in more detail than he'd intended, describing Emma's theft of baby formula, his decision to terminate her employment, and his recent discovery of the circumstances that had led to her desperation. As he spoke, he watched Janet's expression shift from suspicion to understanding to something that might have been disappointment in the human species. "You fired a pregnant woman for stealing baby formula," Janet said when he finished, her voice carefully neutral. "Yes. And now you want to, what? Apologize?" Alexander realized he hadn't thought that far ahead. "I want to help. I want to fix what I broke." Janet leaned back in her chair, studying him with the intensity of someone who'd spent years learning to read people's motivations. "Mr. Kane, I've been running this shelter for 15 years. I've seen a lot of wealthy people show up here wanting to help. Sometimes they're genuine. Sometimes they're looking for tax deductions or good publicity. And sometimes they're trying to ease their own guilt without actually changing anything meaningful. Which category do you think I fall into?" "I don't know yet," Janet admitted. "But I'll tell you this, Emma Rodriguez is one of the strongest, most determined young women I've ever met. She's been here for 2 months, and in that time she's helped 3 other mothers find childcare, taught 2 women how to budget on government assistance, and volunteered to clean the common areas every day even though she has a newborn to care for. She's not looking for charity, Mr. Kane. She's looking for opportunity." The description of Emma's character made Alexander's guilt feel even heavier. He'd destroyed the life of someone who spent her time at a homeless shelter helping other people, someone who'd apparently maintained her dignity and generosity even while struggling to survive. "Can I see her?" he asked. Janet was quiet for a moment, then reached for her phone. "Let me call upstairs and see if she's willing to meet with you. But Mr. Kane, if you're here to ease your conscience and then disappear back to your mansion, I'd rather you leave now. These women don't need more disappointment in their lives." While Janet made the call, Alexander found himself studying the drawings on the bulletin board more closely. Most were clearly the work of young children's stick figures holding hands. Under rainbow skies, houses with crooked chimneys and flowers in the yard, families with pets and playgrounds, and all the simple symbols of happiness that children drew instinctively. Mixed in with the children's art were a few more sophisticated pieces, including what looked like a detailed pencil sketch of the Seattle skyline. "That's Emma's," Janet said, hanging up the phone and noticing his attention. "She draws when Luna is sleeping. Helps her think, she says." Alexander studied the sketch more closely. It was beautifully done, with an artist's eye for detail and composition. The Space Needle rose gracefully in the center, surrounded by the familiar peaks and valleys of the city's skyline. But there was something else in the drawing: small figures scattered throughout the scene. People walking dogs, children playing in parks, couples holding hands on benches. Emma had populated her version of Seattle with humanity, with the kind of life that Alexander saw from his penthouse windows, but never really noticed. "She see you," Janet said. "But she's bringing Luna, and if the baby gets fussy, the conversation ends. Understood?" Alexander nodded, though he had no experience with babies and no idea what might make one fussy. Janet led him through a corridor lined with doors, each marked with a number and a small nameplate. The carpet was industrial grade but clean, and the walls were painted in soft colors that probably came from whatever paint had been donated that year. They passed a common kitchen where several women were preparing what looked like a communal lunch, their children playing nearby with toys that had clearly seen better days, but were loved nonetheless. Emma's room was at the end of the hall, and Janet knocked softly before opening the door. "Emma, Mr. Kane is here to see you." The room was barely larger than Alexander's bathroom, furnished with a single bed, a small dresser, and a crib that took up most of the remaining space. But somehow Emma had made it feel like home. The narrow window was dressed with curtains that looked handmade. The dresser top was arranged with a few personal items and some more of her artwork, and a mobile made from colorful paper cranes hung over the crib. Emma Rodriguez sat on the edge of the bed, holding a baby who couldn't have been more than 3 months old. She looked much thinner than in her employment photo, her dark hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, wearing jeans and a sweater that had both seen better days. But her eyes were the same warm brown Alexander remembered, though now they held wariness instead of hope. "Mr. Kane," she said quietly, her voice carrying no emotion he could identify. Alexander found himself frozen in the doorway, struck by the surreal nature of the situation. 6 months ago, he'd signed papers firing this woman without giving her a second thought. Now he was standing in her temporary home, looking at the consequences of his decision, made flesh in the form of a young mother who'd lost everything. "Emma," he said, then stopped, realizing he had no idea how to continue. The baby Luna, he remembered, made a soft sound and turned her head toward his voice. Alexander caught a glimpse of serious dark eyes and impossibly small features, and something in his chest clenched tight. This was what Emma had been trying to protect when she'd stolen baby formula. This tiny, perfect person who depended entirely on her mother's ability to provide for her. "Janet said you wanted to talk to me," Emma said when the silence stretched too long. Her voice was steady, but Alexander could see the tension in her shoulders, the protective way she held her daughter. "I made a mistake," Alexander said, the words feeling inadequate even as he spoke them. "A terrible mistake. I fired you without understanding your situation, without considering that you might have been desperate rather than dishonest. Emma's expression didn't change. You fired me because I stole food from your company. You were pregnant and trying to feed your unborn child. I was still stealing. Her calm acceptance of responsibility made Alexander feel worse, not better. You were surviving. There's a difference. Emma adjusted Luna in her arms, and Alexander noticed how naturally she moved, how completely comfortable she seemed with motherhood despite her youth. Is that why you're here? To tell me you understand why I did what I did. I'm here because I want to make things right. How? The simple question stopped Alexander cold. How did someone make this right? How did he undo months of homelessness, of uncertainty, of a young mother wondering if she'd be able to keep her child safe and fed? How did he repair the damage caused by his own willful blindness to the circumstances that drove people to desperation? I could give you your job back, he said, though even as the words left his mouth, he knew they weren't enough. Emma almost smiled, but there was no humor in it. A night custodian job that pays $12 an hour? That wouldn't even cover childcare, assuming I could find someone willing to watch Luna overnight. Alexander felt the logic of her situation settling around him like a trap. She was right, of course. The job he'd fired her from had never been adequate for supporting a child, had never offered the kind of security that would allow someone to build a stable life. He'd been offering her employment, not opportunity. What if I could offer you something better? Like what? Alexander realized he was improvising, making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. But looking at Emma holding her daughter in this tiny room, surrounded by her few possessions, and her homemade attempts to create beauty in an impossible situation, he felt a determination unlike anything he'd experienced in the business world. What did you do before you worked for my company? I was in college, Emma said. Art therapy program at University of Washington. I was in my senior year when I got pregnant. The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. Emma hadn't just been a custodian, she'd been a student, someone with career ambitions and professional goals. Someone who'd been forced to abandon her education to work minimum wage jobs in order to survive. You never finished your degree? Hard to pay tuition when you're working 2 jobs and saving money for prenatal care. Alexander found himself doing calculations in his head. University of Washington's art therapy program, tuition costs, living expenses, childcare. The numbers were staggering for someone earning $12 an hour, but they represented pocket change in his world. What if I helped you finish school? Emma's wariness sharpened into suspicion. Why would you do that? Because I can. Because you deserve the chance to build the life you were working toward before I interfered. Mr. Kane, Emma said carefully, I appreciate that you feel bad about firing me, but I don't need your charity. I need sustainable employment and affordable childcare, and maybe someday enough money saved up to go back to school on my own terms. Her dignity in the face of his clumsy attempt to help made Alexander realize how little he understood about pride, about what it meant to maintain your sense of self when the world seemed determined to strip it away. Emma wasn't looking for a handout, she was looking for a fair chance to succeed on her own merit. Luna began to fuss, making small sounds. That quickly escalated into crying. Emma stood and began to pace the small room, bouncing gently and murmuring soft words in what sounded like Spanish. Alexander watched, fascinated despite himself by the practiced ease with which she soothed her daughter. She's beautiful, he said, surprised by the sincerity in his own voice. Emma's expression softened slightly. She's everything to me. The baby shoes, Alexander said suddenly. Your mother left them in my house. They were incredible. Emma stopped pacing, her eyes widening. My mother works for you? The surprise in her voice made Alexander realize that Maria had been keeping secrets from both sides, protecting her daughter's pride while trying to find ways to help her. She's my housekeeper, She didn't tell you? Emma sank back onto the bed, Luna still fussing in her arms. She said she found a job cleaning houses I didn't know. She trailed off, then looked up at Alexander with new understanding. That's how you found me. She told you where I was. She told me about the baby shoes. About you knitting them while you were pregnant. About Luna not having anywhere to wear them. Tears appeared in Emma's eyes, though she blinked them back quickly. I made so many pairs. I thought we'd have our own place by now. I thought Luna would have a nursery, a room full of beautiful things. The pain in her voice made Alexander's chest tight. She will. You don't know that. I know that I have more money than I could spend in 10 lifetimes. And you have talent and determination and a daughter who deserves every opportunity in the world. I know that I made a mistake that hurt you, and I have the power to fix it. Emma studied his face for a long moment, Luna finally settling into quiet alertness in her arms. What exactly are you proposing? Alexander realized he was about to make the most important business proposal of his life, and it had nothing to do with profit margins or market share. Come work for me. Not as a custodian, as my director of community outreach. I'll pay you enough to afford proper housing and childcare, and I'll cover your tuition to finish your art therapy degree. In exchange, you help me figure out how to use my company's resources to actually help people instead of just making money. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. Alexander could hear Luna's soft breathing, the distant sounds of the shelter's common areas, and his own heartbeat loud in his ears. Why? Emma asked finally. Because I've spent 15 years building a company that makes me richer every day, and I've never once asked myself what the point was. Because I fired you for trying to feed your child, and that says something about who I've become that I don't like. Because you made those baby shoes with your own hands while wondering if you'd ever have a safe place for your daughter to wear them, and that's the kind of love I've been missing my entire life. Emma was quiet for so long that Alexander began to think she might not respond at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I can't just trust you because you feel guilty. I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to let me prove that I can be better than the man who fired you. And if you decide later that this was a mistake, if you get tired of playing benefactor and want your old life back, Alexander considered the question seriously. Then you'll have your degree, work experience in a field you're passionate about, and enough money saved to give Luna a good start in life. The worst-case scenario is that you're better off than you are right now. Luna made a soft cooing sound, and Emma looked down at her daughter with an expression of such fierce love that Alexander felt like an intruder witnessing something sacred. I need to think about it, Emma said finally. Of course. And I need to talk to my mother. If she's been working for you all this time without telling me, she was trying to help you. She knew you'd be too proud to accept help if you knew it was connected to me. She was right, Emma admitted. I would have told her to quit. Alexander stood to leave, then hesitated. Can I ask you something? Why did you leave the baby shoes in my bedroom? Your mother could have just brought them to you. Emma's cheeks colored slightly. I wanted to see where you lived. I wanted to understand what kind of person could fire someone over baby formula without caring about the reasons. I thought maybe if I saw your house, saw how you lived, I could figure out how to hate you properly. And did you figure out how to hate me? Emma looked around her tiny room at the handmade curtains and paper crane mobile, at all the ways she'd tried to create beauty and safety in an impossible situation. I saw your house, she said quietly. It's beautiful and empty and cold. I realize that you probably don't know how to love anything, so how could I expect you to understand love disguised as theft? Her words hit him harder than any business rival's insult, any board member's criticism, any magazine article questioning his methods. Emma had seen through his defenses to the truth he'd been hiding from himself, that he'd built a life so focused on protection and control, that he'd forgotten how to care about anything beyond his own safety. "You're right," he said simply. "Am I?" Alexander thought about his empty mansion, his solitary meals, his carefully orchestrated relationships that never demanded vulnerability or genuine emotion. "I don't know how to love anything, but I'd like to learn." Emma shifted Luna to her other arm, and the baby's serious dark eyes seemed to focus on Alexander's face. "Learning to love means risking being hurt. I'm beginning to understand that. It means caring about someone else's happiness more than your own comfort. Yes, it means that sometimes the right thing to do costs more than money can measure." Alexander nodded, feeling like a student receiving instruction in a subject he'd never studied, but desperately needed to understand. "I'll think about your offer," Emma said. "But I have conditions." "Name them." "If I come work for you, it's as your equal, not your charity case. I want a real job with real responsibilities and real consequences if I don't perform well. I don't want to be your good deed." "Agreed. And I want to help design the community outreach programs myself. I know what it's like to need help, and I know what kind of help actually makes a difference. You don't get to swoop in with your money and decide what poor people need without asking them." Alexander found himself smiling for the first time since finding the baby shoes. "That's exactly why I need you. And Luna comes first, always. If my daughter needs me, work waits. Of course." Emma studied his face, looking for signs of insincerity or hidden agendas. "You realize that I'm going to challenge everything you think you know about business and success and what makes life worth living? I'm counting on it." Luna chose that moment to reach out with one tiny hand, her fingers grasping at the air between her and Alexander. Without thinking, he extended his finger, and she wrapped her impossibly small hand around it with surprising strength. The contact was electric. Alexander had shaken hands with world leaders, signed billion-dollar deals, commanded the respect of the most powerful people in corporate America. But he'd never felt anything like the trust in Luna's grip, the simple acceptance of his presence in her small world. "She likes you," Emma observed, surprise evident in her voice. "I've never held a baby," Alexander admitted. "Would you like to?" The question terrified him. "I don't know how." "Neither did I, 3 months ago." Emma stood carefully and moved toward him, Luna still gripping his finger. "Support her head and neck," she instructed, guiding his arms into position. "She's stronger than she looks, but she's still learning how to control her movements." Alexander found himself holding a baby for the first time in his life, this tiny person who weighed almost nothing but somehow felt like the most important thing he'd ever been trusted with. Luna looked up at him with serious eyes, studying his face with the intense focus that babies brought to new experiences. "She's perfect," he whispered, surprised by the emotion in his own voice. "She's my miracle," Emma said softly. "Even when everything else was falling apart, even when I didn't know where we'd sleep or what we'd eat, she was perfect." Alexander understood then what Emma had been trying to tell him about love. Looking down at Luna, feeling the weight of her trust and her vulnerability, he experienced something he'd never felt before, the desire to protect someone else at any cost, to put another person's well-being above his own comfort or convenience. This was what he'd destroyed when he'd fired Emma. Not just a job or an income, but a mother's ability to provide for her child, to create the safe and stable world that every baby deserved. "I'm sorry," he said, and this time the words carried the full weight of his understanding. "I'm so sorry for what I did to both of you." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "I forgive you." The simple statement hit Alexander harder than any business victory, any personal achievement, any moment of triumph in his carefully constructed life. Emma Rodriguez, holding nothing but her dignity and her determination to build a better life for her daughter, had just given him something he'd never thought to ask: for forgiveness for being human, for making mistakes, for learning too late. What really mattered Luna made a soft sound and reached up to touch Alexander's face with her tiny hand, her fingers exploring the unfamiliar texture of his skin. He found himself smiling down at her, this perfect little person who had no idea that her existence had just changed everything about how he understood the world. "I'll give you my answer tomorrow," Emma said, accepting Luna back into her arms with the practiced ease of new motherhood. "Whatever you decide, I want to help. Even if you don't want to work for me, even if you never want to see me again, I want to make sure you and Luna have what you need." Emma nodded, but Alexander could see the wariness returning to her eyes. "We'll see." As Alexander prepared to leave, he found himself reluctant to return to his empty mansion, to his solitary life of conference calls and profit margins and achievements that impressed everyone except himself. For the first time in his adult life, he'd experienced something that money couldn't buy: the simple joy of holding a baby who trusted him completely, the profound satisfaction of seeing forgiveness in the eyes of someone he'd wronged. "Emma," he said from the doorway, "thank you. For what?" "For showing me what I've been missing." The drive back to his mansion felt longer than usual, as if the distance between Emma's world and his had somehow expanded during their conversation. Alexander found himself taking a different route, driving through neighborhoods he'd never explored, seeing Seattle through new eyes. He passed apartment complexes where families hung laundry on tiny balconies, playgrounds where children played, while their parents watched from benches, community centers advertising free meals and job training programs. This was the Seattle where Emma had been trying to build a life, where thousands of people worked multiple jobs and stretched every dollar and still struggled to provide basic security for their children. Alexander's phone had 17 missed calls and 43 unread emails, but for the first time in his corporate career, he didn't care. The business world that had consumed his entire adult life suddenly felt less urgent than the question of whether Emma Rodriguez would give him the chance to become a better man. When he finally arrived home, the mansion felt different. The marble floors and designer furniture and museum quality artwork that had once represented the pinnacle of success now felt cold and sterile. Alexander walked through rooms that could have housed Emma's entire shelter, spaces filled with beautiful objects that no one ever used or enjoyed. In his bedroom, the baby shoes were still sitting by the fireplace where he'd found them. Alexander picked them up carefully, holding them in his large hands and marveling again at the intricate craftsmanship, at the love that had guided every stitch. These tiny shoes represented everything he'd never understood about what made life meaningful. They were proof that someone could create beauty, even in desperate circumstances, that love could flourish even when survival was uncertain, that hope could persist even when the future offered no guarantees. Alexander Kane had spent 34 years building walls between himself and the world, accumulating money and power as shields against vulnerability. But a pair of baby shoes and a young mother's forgiveness had begun to crack those walls, letting in light he'd forgotten existed. Tomorrow, Emma would give him her answer. Tomorrow he would discover whether his wealth could be transformed into something that actually mattered, whether his success could be used to create opportunities for others, instead of just protecting himself. For the first time in years, Alexander Kane went to sleep thinking about someone other than himself. He thought about Luna's serious dark eyes and tiny grasping fingers. He thought about Emma's dignity in the face of impossible circumstances, her determination to build a better life for her daughter despite every obstacle the world had placed in her path. Most of all, he thought about the possibility that it wasn't too late to become the kind of man who deserved the trust he'd seen in a baby's eyes, the kind of man who could use his power to create love instead of fear. The baby shoes sat on his nightstand, a reminder that the most important things in life couldn't be bought or controlled or protected. They could only be nurtured, cherished, and allowed to grow in their own time in their own way. Alexander Kane closed his eyes and dreamed of tiny hands and hopeful futures, of second chances and the courage to love without guarantees. For the first time in his life, he dreamed of becoming someone worth knowing. The phone call came at 6 in the morning, jarring Alexander from the first peaceful sleep he'd had in weeks. Emma's voice was tense, urgent in a way that immediately set his nerves on edge. "Mr. Kane, it's Emma Rodriguez. I need your help." Alexander sat up in bed, instantly alert. "What's wrong?" "Luna's sick. She's been running a fever all night. And she's not eating. The shelter doesn't have a car I can use, and the emergency room wait times are hours long. I can't afford an ambulance, and I don't know what else to do." The desperation in her voice cut through Alexander like a blade. "I'll be there in 15 minutes. You don't have to. I'm already getting dressed." Alexander threw on clothes without caring what they were, grabbed his keys, and drove through the empty Seattle streets with a recklessness that would have horrified his insurance company. The urgency in Emma's voice had triggered something primal in him, a need to protect that he'd never experienced before. When he arrived at the shelter, Emma was waiting by the entrance with Luna wrapped in a blanket, her face pale with worry. The baby was clearly unwell, making weak crying sounds that spoke of discomfort and confusion. "Thank you for coming," Emma said as she climbed into his car, settling Luna carefully in her arms. "I know you didn't sign up for this. Where's the nearest children's hospital?" "Seattle Children's, but Mr. Kane, I need to tell you something. I can't afford this. Whatever they need to do for Luna, I don't have insurance that covers emergency visits." Alexander pulled into traffic, his mind already working through solutions. "Don't worry about the money. I can't let you pay for my daughter's medical bills." "Yes, you can." His voice carried the same authority he used in boardrooms, but underneath was something softer. "Emma, you called me because you were desperate, and I was the only person. You knew who could help. Let me help." The drive to Seattle Children's Hospital took 23 minutes through morning traffic, during which Luna's condition seemed to worsen. Her fever spiked, and she became listless in a way that clearly terrified Emma. "She's never been this sick before," Emma whispered, touching her daughter's forehead with shaking fingers. "What if something's really wrong? What if I've been a terrible mother and missed the signs of something serious?" "You're not a terrible mother," Alexander said firmly. "You're here, you're paying attention, you're getting her help. That's what good mothers do." At the hospital, Alexander's name and presence cut through the usual bureaucratic delays with surgical precision. Within minutes, Luna was being examined by a pediatric specialist while Emma answered rapid-fire questions about symptoms, feeding, schedules, and recent changes in behavior. Dr. Sarah Chun was a small woman with gentle hands and an authoritative manner that immediately inspired confidence. She examined Luna with practiced efficiency while explaining each step of the process to Emma. "It looks like a respiratory infection," Dr. Chun concluded after reviewing test results. "Common in babies Luna's age, especially those living in crowded conditions where viruses spread easily. We'll need to keep her overnight for monitoring and for fluids, but with proper treatment, she should be fine." The relief on Emma's face was so profound that Alexander felt his own chest loosen. In response, he hadn't realized how much tension he'd been carrying until it was released. "However," Dr. Chun continued, "I do have some concerns about Luna's overall health. She's underweight for her age, and there are signs of mild nutritional deficiency." "Are you having trouble with feeding?" Emma's cheeks flushed with shame. "Sometimes. When money's tight, I make sure she gets formula, but I don't always eat regularly myself. The doctor at the clinic said breastfeeding mothers need extra nutrition." "But," she trailed off, unwilling to admit the full extent of their poverty to a stranger. Alexander felt anger rise in his chest, not at Emma but at a system that forced mothers to choose between their own health and their children's. "We'll get a nutritionist to work with you," Dr. Chun said kindly. "And I'd like to set up regular checkups to monitor Luna's development." Do you have a pediatrician? The free clinic downtown, but they're only open 2 days a week, and there's usually a 3-hour wait. Dr. Chun glanced at Alexander, then back at Emma. I'd be happy to take Luna on as a regular patient. We have a program for families experiencing financial hardship. Alexander knew the program she was referring to because Kane Technologies had donated to it the previous year as a tax write-off. He'd never thought about the actual families who benefited from corporate charity until now. As Luna was settled into a pediatric room for overnight observation, Emma sat beside the crib while Alexander found himself standing awkwardly by the window. The room was designed to be cheerful, with colorful murals and child-sized furniture. But the medical equipment and sterile smell reminded him that they were here because Emma couldn't provide the kind of stable, healthy environment that her daughter needed. I should go, Alexander said quietly. You'll want to stay with her. Actually, Emma said, not looking away from Luna. Could you stay, just for a while? I've never been in a hospital with her before, and I don't know what to expect. The request surprised him, of course. Alexander pulled a chair next to Emma's and found himself studying Luna's sleeping face. Even sick, she was beautiful, with long dark eyelashes and the kind of perfect features that made people stop and smile at babies in grocery stores. She looks like you, he said. Everyone says she looks like her father, Emma replied, then immediately looked like she regretted mentioning him. Where is he? Emma was quiet for so long that Alexander thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. His name was David. We were together for about a year, and I thought we were building something real. When I told him I was pregnant, he said he wasn't ready to be a father. He gave me $500 for an abortion and disappeared. I'm sorry. I kept the money for prenatal vitamins and used clothing. Emma's smile was brittle around the edges. Best investment he ever made, even if he didn't know it. Alexander found himself thinking about David, this man who'd walked away from Emma and Luna without a backward glance. What kind of person abandoned a woman they'd claimed to love when she needed them most? What kind of man missed the chance to know Luna, to be part of her life? The thought made him examine his own choices with uncomfortable clarity. How many people had he abandoned, not through dramatic exits, but through simple indifference? How many employees, business partners, even casual acquaintances had needed help that he'd been too focused on his own goals to notice? Can I ask you something? Emma said. Anything. Why are you really here? Not just tonight, but all of this. The job offer, wanting to help with my education, paying for Luna's medical bills. What do you get out of it? Alexander considered several diplomatic answers before deciding that Emma deserved honesty. I get the chance to become someone I can respect, he said finally. I've spent 15 years building a company and accumulating wealth, but I've never done anything that mattered. I've never helped anyone, never made a difference in a way that couldn't be measured in dollars. When I held Luna yesterday, when she trusted me enough to fall asleep in my arms, I felt something I'd never experienced before. What? Purpose, maybe. Or just the possibility that there might be more to life than protecting myself from everyone else. Emma studied his face in the dim hospital lighting. You know that helping me and Luna won't fix whatever's broken in your life, right? We're not your redemption project. I know, but maybe you could be my teachers. Teachers? You know how to love someone more than yourself. You know how to find hope in impossible circumstances. You know how to create beauty with your own hands when the world offers you nothing but ugliness. Alexander gestured toward the sleeping baby. Luna is proof that you can create something perfect, even when everything else is falling apart. Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. She is perfect, isn't she? Absolutely perfect. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching Luna sleep. Alexander found himself thinking about the conversation he'd had with his board of directors the previous week. A meeting about acquiring a small tech startup that would increase their market share by 3%. At the time, it had seemed vitally important. Now, watching a sick baby breathe steadily while her mother worried about medical bills, corporate acquisitions felt like elaborate games played by people who'd forgotten what actually mattered. "I've made my decision," Emma said suddenly. Alexander's heart rate spiked. "About the job? About everything. Luna being sick, having to call you for help, sitting here worrying about bills while my daughter needs medical care. It's made me realize that pride is a luxury I can't afford." Emma turned to face him directly. "I'll take your offer, but with modifications." "What kind of modifications?" "I want to start immediately, even before I go back to school. I want to work with you to understand how your company operates, how decisions get made, where the money goes. And I want to bring other voices into the conversation. People from the shelter, single mothers, families who are struggling to make ends meet." Alexander felt excitement building in his chest. "You want to democratize our community outreach. I want to make sure it's actually reaching the community, not just making your board feel good about corporate responsibility. What else?" Emma hesitated, then forged ahead. "I want you to spend time in the real world. Not just visiting the shelter or writing checks, but actually understanding how normal people live. I want you to shop for groceries on a food stamp budget, try to find affordable childcare, figure out how to get to work when your car breaks down and you can't afford repairs." The suggestion terrified and intrigued Alexander in equal measure. "You want me to live like someone without money. I want you to live like someone without unlimited money. There's a difference between poor and normal, Mr. Kane. Most people aren't wealthy, but they're not homeless either. They're working hard and making sacrifices and trying to build stable lives for their families." Alexander found himself nodding. "When do we start?" "As soon as Luna's better and I can find proper childcare." "What if I arranged for on-site childcare at the office? A professional nursery where Luna could stay while you're working?" Emma's expression shifted to something Alexander couldn't quite read. "You'd do that?" "I'd do whatever it takes to make this work." A nurse appeared in the doorway, checking Luna's vital signs and adjusting her fore. The baby stirred but didn't wake, her small hand curling around the edge of her blanket. "Her fever's coming down," the nurse reported. "She should be much better by morning." As the nurse left, Emma reached into the crib to gently stroke Luna's hair. "I used to imagine what her life would be like," she said softly. "When I was pregnant, I'd lie awake at night dreaming about the things I'd teach her, the places we'd go together, the person she'd become. I never imagined we'd end up in a homeless shelter." "But you also never imagined she'd have someone like you as a mother," Alexander said. "Someone strong enough to ask for help when she needs it, brave enough to take risks for her daughter's future. Someone stubborn enough to make demands of billionaires." Alexander smiled, especially that. Emma leaned back in her chair, finally looking relaxed for the first time since he'd arrived at the shelter. "Can I tell you something?" "Always." "When I was growing up, my mother cleaned houses for wealthy families. She'd come home with stories about these beautiful homes, amazing kitchens, children who had more toys than they could possibly play with. I used to think that rich people were different from us, that they had some secret knowledge about how to be happy. And now I think maybe everybody's just trying to figure it out as they go along. Rich people just have more expensive ways of being confused." Alexander laughed, surprised by the sound of his own genuine amusement. "That might be the most accurate assessment of wealth I've ever heard." As the night wore on, Alexander found himself sharing stories about his childhood, about the mother who'd worked multiple jobs to keep them housed and fed, about the loneliness of building a life based on avoiding vulnerability. Emma listened without judgment, occasionally asking questions that revealed a sharp intelligence and an intuitive understanding of human nature. When Luna woke briefly around midnight, fussing and uncomfortable, Alexander watched Emma transform into someone completely focused and competent. She spoke to her daughter in soft Spanish, sang a lullaby that was probably passed down through generations, and somehow communicated calm and safety through nothing but her presence. "Where did you learn to be such a good mother?" Alexander asked. "From my own mother, I guess. And from making a lot of mistakes and trying to do better the next time." "What's the hardest part?" Emma considered the question seriously. "Knowing that everything I do affects her future, but not knowing what the right choices are. Like, tonight, should I have brought her to the hospital sooner? Was I being negligent by waiting? But if I bring her every time she's fussy, I'll go bankrupt from medical bills. You made the right choice tonight, this time. But what about next? Time or the time after that? What if someday I guess wrong?" Alexander realized he was getting a glimpse into the constant weight of responsibility that came with loving someone completely. Every decision carried consequences not just for yourself, but for another person who depended entirely on your judgment. "I think," he said carefully, "that loving someone means accepting that you'll make mistakes, but that you'll keep trying to do better. Is that your plan with me and Luna? To keep trying to do better?" Alexander met her eyes directly. "It's my plan with everything from now on." When morning came, Luna was significantly improved. Her fever had broken, she was eating normally, and Dr. Chun declared her ready to go home. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Alexander realized that the previous 24 hours had changed something fundamental about how he understood his own life. Sitting in a hospital room, worrying about a baby's health, watching a young mother navigate fear and responsibility with grace, it had been more meaningful than any business achievement, any financial milestone, any recognition he'd ever received. "So," Emma said as they walked toward the hospital exit, Luna alert and curious in her arms, "when do you want to start your education in how normal people live?" Alexander smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years. "How about right now? I'll drive you home, but you're navigating. No GPS, no shortcuts through neighborhoods I've never seen. I want to learn the city the way you know it." As they drove through Seattle's morning traffic, Emma directing him through streets he'd never traveled, pointing out bus stops and community centers and the small businesses that made up the fabric of everyday life, Alexander felt something he'd never experienced before. He felt like he was finally going home. 6 months later, Alexander Kane stood in the conference room of Kane Technologies, but the space looked nothing like it had before Emma Rodriguez walked into his life. Gone were the intimidating black leather chairs and imposing mahogany table. Instead, the room featured comfortable seating arranged in circles, walls covered with colorful artwork created by children from local community centers, and a corner dedicated to toys and books for families who brought their children to meetings. The transformation hadn't been easy. Board members had initially balked at the changes, questioning whether a technology company needed a nursery, whether community input was necessary for corporate decisions, and whether Alexander had lost his business acumen entirely. Some shareholders had threatened to pull their investments when Kane Technologies announced its new community partnership initiative. Alexander had weathered their criticism with a calm that surprised even himself. The man who'd once made decisions based purely on profit margins now found himself explaining the long-term value of building genuine relationships with the communities they served. The company that had focused exclusively on quarterly earnings was now measuring success in terms of lives changed, opportunities created, and trust earned. Emma entered the conference room carrying Luna, who at 9 months old had become something of a mascot around the Kane Technologies offices. The baby's presence had initially made some employees uncomfortable, but watching Alexander's transformation from distant CEO to someone who would pause board meetings to make funny faces at a fussy infant had changed the entire corporate culture. "Ready for the big presentation?" Emma asked, settling Luna into the specially designed high chair that had become a permanent fixture in the conference room. Alexander straightened his tie nervously. "I still can't believe the mayor wants to implement our housing initiative citywide." "Believe it," Emma said with a smile. "When you actually listen to people instead of assuming you know what they need, amazing things happen." The past 6 months had been a masterclass in humility for Alexander. Emma had insisted on keeping her promise to educate him about how ordinary people lived, and the experience had been simultaneously humbling and enlightening. He'd spent a week living on a minimum wage budget, discovering that groceries cost 3 times what he'd imagined, and that finding reliable childcare was nearly impossible for working parents. He'd ridden public transportation during rush hour, waited in line at government assistance offices, and attended community meetings where residents voiced concerns about gentrification and displacement. Most importantly, he'd learned to listen without trying to immediately solve problems with money. Emma had taught him that sustainable change required understanding root causes, not just treating symptoms. The Community Partnership Initiative had grown from those lessons. Instead of the traditional corporate charity model of writing checks to existing organizations, Kane Technologies had developed a revolutionary approach to community engagement. They hired residents from low-income neighborhoods as paid consultants, created microgrant programs designed by community members themselves, and established satellite offices in underserved areas where people could access technology training and job placement services. The results had exceeded everyone's expectations. Employment rates in their partner communities had increased by 40%. 3 new small businesses had launched with support from Kane Technologies' entrepreneurship program. Most remarkably, employee satisfaction within the company had reached all-time highs as workers found meaning in jobs that contributed to positive change. Luna babbled happily from her high chair, reaching for the colorful papers Emma had spread across the table. At 9 months, she was a curious, active baby who seemed to find joy in everything around her. Watching her grow had given Alexander a perspective on time and priorities that no business school could have taught. "She's going to be walking soon," Emma observed, intercepting Luna's attempt to grab important documents. "Mrs. Patterson thinks she'll be an early walker," Alexander replied, smiling at the memory of his former housekeeper's visit the previous week. Margaret Patterson had returned from retirement specifically to meet Luna, declaring that any baby who could capture Alexander Kane's heart was worth knowing personally. The transformation in Alexander's personal life had been as dramatic as his professional changes. His mansion, once a sterile showcase of wealth, now featured child-proofed corners, a nursery that had been designed with input from both Emma and Luna, and common areas where laughter and conversation had replaced the echoing silence of his former solitude. Emma had moved into the mansion 3 months earlier, not as an employee or dependent, but as a partner in both their professional and personal endeavors. Their relationship had evolved naturally from crisis-forged partnership to deep friendship, to something neither of them had expected when tiny pink baby shoes first brought them together. The conference room door opened, and Mayor Jennifer Walsh entered with her usual commanding presence. A woman in her 50s who'd built her political career on pragmatic solutions to urban problems. She'd initially been skeptical of Kane Technologies' community initiatives. Wealthy corporations promising to help the poor was a story she'd heard too many times before, usually with disappointing results. "Alexander, Emma," she said, taking her seat at the circular table. "I have to admit, when you first pitched this housing program, I thought it was another well-intentioned disaster waiting to happen." Alexander and Emma exchanged glances. They'd learned to weather skepticism by letting their results speak for themselves. "But," the mayor continued, "the pilot program has been remarkable. Not just the housing units themselves, but the way you've involved residents in every aspect of planning and implementation. The community ownership model is something we've never seen work at this scale." Emma leaned forward, Luna contentedly playing with a set of colorful blocks. "What specifically are you hoping to implement citywide?" "All of it," Mayor Walsh said, spreading out architectural plans and budget projections. "The mixed-income housing developments, the cooperative ownership structure, the on-site childcare, and community services. We want to replicate your model in 6 neighborhoods over the next 3 years." Alexander felt a surge of pride that had nothing to do with personal achievement and everything to do with knowing that their work would create stable homes for hundreds of families. The housing initiative had been Emma's brainchild, born from her experience of homelessness and her understanding of what families actually needed to thrive. Traditional affordable housing focused solely on providing units at below-market rent. Emma's program created communities where residents could build equity through cooperative ownership, where on-site services eliminated many of the barriers that kept families unstable, and where children could grow up in environments designed to support their development. "What's the timeline?" Emma asked, already thinking through implementation challenges. "We want to break ground on the first site within 6 months," the mayor replied. "But I need to know that Kane Technologies is committed for the long term. This isn't a 3-year pilot program. This is a 20-year community transformation." Alexander looked at Luna, who had successfully stacked 3 blocks and was reaching for a 4th with determined concentration. In 20 years, she'd be in college, perhaps studying to become the kind of leader who could solve problems her generation would inherit. The thought of contributing to a world where Luna could thrive filled him with purpose he'd never imagined possible. "We're committed," he said simply. The meeting continued for 2 hours, covering financing structures, community engagement protocols, and quality control measures. Throughout the discussion, Luna provided periodic commentary in the form of babbles and giggles, occasionally throwing blocks with impressive accuracy. Rather than disrupting the proceedings, her presence seemed to remind everyone why their work mattered. When Mayor Walsh finally departed with signed agreements and promises of continued collaboration, Alexander found himself alone with Emma and Luna in the conference room that had become the heart of their transformed company. "Do you ever think about how different things would be if you hadn't left those baby shoes?" Alexander asked, helping Emma gather toys and papers. "I think about how different things would be if you hadn't been willing to change," Emma replied. "Anyone can find baby shoes in their bedroom. Not everyone would have tracked down the mother and asked how they could help." Alexander lifted Luna from her high chair, marveling as always at how natural it felt to hold her. "I tracked you down because I felt guilty. You stayed because you felt something else." "What?" Emma smiled, the expression that still had the power to stop his heart entirely. "Love, for Luna, for me, for the possibility that we could build something beautiful together." The word hung in the air between them, acknowledging what they'd both known for months, but had been too cautious to speak aloud. Their relationship had evolved beyond professional partnership, beyond friendship, into something deeper and more complex than either of them had expected. "I love you both," Alexander said quietly, Luna contentedly examining his tie with serious concentration. "More than I thought possible. Even when Luna keeps you awake at night with teething, especially then." Emma stepped closer, reaching up to adjust his collar. "I love you too. Both the man you were becoming when I met you and the man you've chosen to be." Alexander had never imagined that love could feel like this, not the desperate, possessive emotion he'd seen destroy his mother's relationships, but something stable and strengthening that made him want to be better than he'd ever thought possible. Luna chose that moment to reach for Emma, making the soft sounds that meant she was ready for her afternoon nap. Emma took her daughter into her arms with the practiced ease that Alexander found endlessly fascinating. "There's something I want to ask you," Alexander said, his heart rate accelerating despite months of domestic contentment. "What?" "I want to adopt Luna officially. I want to be her father in every way that matters." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. She already thinks you are her father. And I want to marry you. Not because of contracts or obligations or guilt, but because I can't imagine building a life with anyone else. Is this a proposal? Alexander laughed, realizing he was handling this backwards. I guess it is. Emma Rodriguez, will you marry me? Will you let me be Luna's father? Will you help me keep learning how to love without fear? Emma kissed him. Luna squished happily between them, babbling her approval of the arrangement. Yes, Emma whispered against his lips, to all of it. 6 months later, Alexander Kane and Emma Rodriguez were married in a ceremony that reflected everything they'd learned about what truly mattered. Instead of an expensive venue, they chose the community center in the neighborhood where Kane Technologies had built their first housing development. Instead of an exclusive guest list, they invited residents from all the communities they'd worked with, employees from every level of the company, and children who decorated the space with artwork they'd created in the community art therapy program Emma had established. Luna, now walking with the determined wobble of a 1-year-old, served as flower girl with enthusiasm that made up for any lack of grace. She scattered petals with abandon, clapped during the ceremony, and charmed everyone, present with her obvious joy in the proceedings. The reception featured food from local restaurants that Kane Technologies had helped establish, music from community members who'd benefited from their arts funding, and speeches from residents whose lives had been changed by programs developed through genuine partnership rather than corporate charity. Alexander's mother, Maria Santos, had flown in from the shelter where she now served as director, thanks to the management training program Kane Technologies had developed specifically for community leaders. Her pride in her daughter was evident as she watched Emma dance with Luna, the baby giggling with delight at being spun around the makeshift dance floor. As the evening wound down, Alexander found himself standing outside the community center, Luna sleeping contentedly in his arms while Emma said goodbye to the last guests. The neighborhood around them was safe, clean, and alive with the kind of activity that spoke of communities where families could thrive. Tired? Emma asked, joining him in the quiet evening air. Happy, Alexander corrected. I don't think I really understood what happiness felt like before you two. Even with a teething baby who's been keeping you up all night. Especially with a teething baby who calls me Dada and trusts me to comfort her. Emma leaned against his shoulder, careful not to wake Luna. Do you ever miss your old life? The simplicity of only worrying about yourself. Alexander considered the question seriously. His old life had been predictable, controlled, and utterly empty. This life was chaotic, challenging, and filled with more meaning than he'd ever imagined possible. I miss the sleep, he said finally, making Emma laugh. But everything else? I wouldn't trade a single sleepless night for all the peaceful solitude in the world. Luna stirred in his arms, made a soft sound, and settled back into sleep. In the morning, she'd wake up curious and energetic, ready to explore a world that was safer and more full of opportunity, because her parents had learned to use their resources for love instead of fear. The tiny pink baby shoes that had started everything were now displayed in their living room, a reminder of how small acts of love could transform entire lives. Emma had created them with hope during her darkest period, and somehow that hope had grown into a family, a mission, and a model for how wealth could be used to strengthen communities instead of insulating individuals. As they walked home through neighborhoods where children played safely and families built their futures, Alexander Kane reflected on the journey that had brought them together. He'd started as a man who measured success in dollars and ended as someone who measured it in trust, in love, in the knowledge that his daughter would grow up in a world slightly better than the one he'd inherited. Luna shifted in his arms, her small hand curling around his finger, with the absolute trust that still amazed him every day. In her grip, Alexander felt the weight and wonder of unconditional love the responsibility and joy of fatherhood, and the profound satisfaction of a life lived not just for himself, but for others. Emma took his free hand as they walked, her wedding ring catching the streetlight. "What are you thinking about?" "Baby shoes," Alexander said, smiling at the simplicity of it. "How something so small can change everything. Love is like that," Emma replied. "It starts small, but it grows until it transforms everything it touches." As they reached their home, a house filled with laughter and toys, and the beautiful chaos of family life, Kane understood that he'd finally learned the lesson those tiny pink shoes had been trying to teach him from the beginning. The most important things in life couldn't be controlled or protected or accumulated. They could only be nurtured, cherished, and allowed to grow in their own time and their own way. And sometimes, if you were very lucky, they grew big enough to change not just your own life, but the lives of everyone around you. Luna stirred as they entered the house, opening sleepy eyes to look at the faces of her parents. Alexander kissed her forehead softly, breathing in the sweet scent of baby shampoo and unconditional love. "Welcome home, little one," he whispered. "Welcome to a life built on love." Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.